The candles had burned down to their last inch, and Harriet Chance had not moved from the library floor in 2 hours. She sat with her back against the lowest shelf, her knees drawn up to support the open ledger she had borrowed, without permission from the estate steward's cabinet. A cabinet that had been left unlocked, she told herself, which was not precisely the same as having been invited. Around her, the great library of Ashworth Park arranged itself in the darkness. 12,000 volumes, 4 mahogany reading tables, a globe the size of a cartwheel, and one woman who had no business being there at midnight in a dress she had already worn 3 times that week. The figures in the ledger did not add up. That was why she had come. That was why she was still here, cross-legged on a Persian carpet that probably cost more than her father's entire estate had been worth in its last operating year, running the tip of her finger down a column of tenant rent receipts and finding the same gap she had found the first time, £140, missing between March and June of 1817, documented in the receipt ledger but absent from the quarterly summary sent to the Duke's London solicitors. Someone had made an error, or someone had made a choice. She heard the door. She did not move at first. The library occupied the east wing's ground floor, and the footman's rounds ended at 11. She had timed them. The sound was not a footman's round. It was a single set of footsteps, unhurried and precise, and they stopped at the threshold rather than continuing along the corridor. A lamp was raised. The light found her. Julian Ashworth, 6th Duke of Ashworth, stood in the doorway of his own library and looked at the woman sitting on his floor with an expression that was not anger and not surprise. It was the expression of a man who has been presented with a fact he has not yet classified. Harriet did not stand immediately. She finished the line she was reading, marked it with her thumb, and then set the ledger carefully on the carpet beside her. Then she stood, smoothed her skirt, and said, "Your Grace, I apologize for the intrusion. I found a discrepancy in the estate accounts, and the answer appeared to be in this volume. I intended to replace it before morning." He said nothing for a long moment. He crossed the room, not toward her directly, but toward the reading table nearest the window, where he set his lamp. Then he looked at her again. Which discrepancy? It was not a question. It was the opening of a conversation. Harriet Chance had learned, in 31 years of being the person everyone assigned work to, and thanked afterward with nothing more substantial than their continued absence, that moments of unexpected recognition were best met with precision rather than gratitude. She picked up the ledger, turned it to the page she had marked, and carried it to the reading table. She set it flat under the lamp and pointed to the column. March through June, 1817, she said. £143, 7 shillings in verified tenant receipts. Not carried forward to the quarterly summary. The error recurs at the same interval in 1815 and 1816. Someone adjusted the summary figures but forgot the receipt ledger. Julian Ashworth looked at the column. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her, with the particular stillness of a man who has just identified something he does not yet understand. "Sit down," he said. "There is a second ledger. You will need it." She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. She sat down. He was gone before she could say anything further, and back within 3 minutes, carrying a second volume from a cabinet she had not managed to open. He set it beside the first without commentary. He sat across from her, and they worked until the candles went entirely out and the gray light of early morning replaced them. And by then the missing £143 had a name: the estate's previous steward, who had been relieving himself of a small commission on wool merchant contracts for 3 consecutive years, before his quiet retirement in 1818. When Harriet finally looked up from the accounts, Julian Ashworth was watching her with that same unclassified expression. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a key on the table between them. It was iron, old, fitted with the Ashworth crest at the bow. "Library key," he said. "Come when you need to." She looked at it. She looked at him. She picked it up. Neither of them remarked on the fact that this was an extraordinary thing for a duke to give a woman who had broken into his library at midnight wearing a 3 times worn dress. Some acknowledgments are more powerful for being stated plainly and left alone. To understand why Harriet Chance was in a position to break into anyone's library at midnight, it is necessary to go back 11 years, to the winter her father died. George Chance had been a gentleman of modest means, genuine intellectual curiosity, and almost no practical administrative sense. He had loved his daughter with the particular warmth of a man who had educated her beyond what her situation required, and then departed the world before he could see what she did with it. He died in January of 1808, when Harriet was 20 years old, leaving behind a rented house in Worcestershire, accounts in a condition she could only describe as aspirational, and a cousin named Gerald Fordham, who arrived within the fortnight to serve as executor of the estate. Gerald Fordham was not a cruel man. He was a man who understood the world to operate according to its established machinery, and who had never, in 43 years, found reason to question whether the machinery was correctly designed. He had a wife, 2 daughters, in want of establishment, a solicitor's practice that generated a reliable income, and no desire whatsoever to manage a dead cousin's accounts. He looked at Harriet over the rim of his teacup and said, "You seem to know where everything is. Carry on." She carried on. She carried on for 11 years. The accounts she had inherited were not simply in disorder. They were in a state that suggested her father had operated primarily on optimism and the benevolent inattention of his creditors. There were 7 outstanding debts. 2 of the creditors had begun to make inquiries. The house's lease had 18 months remaining, and the landlord had added a clause Harriet found legally questionable upon her 3rd reading. She was 20 years old, in mourning, and had no formal authority over anything. She started with the creditors. She wrote each of them a letter herself, not in Gerald's name, though she did mention that the estate was being managed on behalf of the Fordham family, outlining the state of each account, proposing a repayment structure, and providing a specific timeline. She was precise and she was honest. The estate would require 14 months to satisfy the debts in full, but it would satisfy them. 4 creditors replied favorably. 2 required a second letter. 1 required 3, and the negotiation of that 3rd letter. A wool merchant named Sims, who dealt in the same regional market her father had used, took 4 mornings and taught her more about contract language than anything she had previously read. Gerald Fordham, informed of this at the quarterly summary she produced for him every 3 months in a neat hand with figures verified twice over, said, "Good, good," and signed where she directed him to sign. There was a moment, in the spring of 1810, when the last of the debts was retired and the lease renewed on terms she had negotiated herself, that Harriet sat at the small writing desk in the house's study and understood that she had managed something real. The accounts were clean. The household was stable. She had done this work for 2 years, with no title, no salary, no acknowledgement beyond Gerald's distracted approval, and she was 22 years old and invisible. She did not weep. She had never been a woman who wept when the accurate response was to think. She picked up the next quarter's account book and opened it to the first page. She was not going to step aside for anyone. Gerald remarried in 1812, a woman of some social aspiration named Mrs. Fordham II, who assessed Harriet on their first meeting with the particular economy of a woman who understood which arrangements suited her household and which did not. Harriet was useful. Mrs. Fordham was clear on that point, and useful things should be retained, but they should not be confused with family. Harriet was assigned 2 rooms on the house's upper floor, a modest yearly allowance that Gerald described as generous without appearing to have verified this, and the continued management of a household that now included 2 stepdaughters, a schedule of social obligations, and Gerald's increasingly complicated business accounts, which he had expanded into property management in 3 neighboring parishes. She managed all of it. She did it well. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing, and Harriet Chance had been keeping multiple rooms standing for so long that she had ceased to expect anyone to notice the architecture. What she had not expected was the notice of Thomas Graves. Thomas Graves was Gerald's solicitor, a man of 60, precise, with a memory for detail that operated like a well-built bridge, reliable under any weight, never decorative. He had watched Harriet present the quarterly accounts for 3 years before he said, at the conclusion of one such meeting, "Miss Chance, when you leave this household, which will happen within the decade unless I am badly mistaken, you should know that you have the capacity for estate management, at a level I encounter perhaps twice in my career. I am telling you this now, because I am not certain anyone else will." She had looked at him with a composure that cost her considerably more than it appeared. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it practically, not as compliment," he said. "Keep records of everything you have managed, specific figures, dates, outcomes. You will need them." She had kept them. She had been keeping them for 6 years, in a small cloth-bound notebook that she carried in the bottom of her traveling case. 37 distinct accounts managed, 14 creditor negotiations, 9 lease renewals, 4 instances of contract renegotiation, 2 near crises averted through early identification, £143 recovered in misapplied wool merchant commissions in a single night. She had not known, when she arrived at Ashworth Park as companion guest to her cousin's wife, who was distantly acquainted with the estate's neighboring family, that any of this would matter to anyone here. She had not known. But she had brought the notebook because Thomas Graves had told her to, and Thomas Graves had never been wrong about anything she could verify. Julian Ashworth had not come to the autumn gathering at Thornwell House, his neighbor's estate, where Gerald and Mrs. Fordham had been invited, and had brought Harriet along as social ballast, because he wished to attend. He had come because there were matters of estate boundary documentation that required the physical presence of both parties, and because Lady Thornwell had made it plain that his absence would be noted in a way that would generate correspondence he did not wish to receive. He arrived at 8:30, when the drawing room was fully arranged for the evening's entertainment. 40 guests, 3 card tables, a string quartet, and a spread of flowers that Harriet privately calculated had cost as much as a farm laborer's annual wage. He wore black, as he generally did at events he intended to survive rather than enjoy. He made the necessary greetings without pausing at any of them. And then, at the edge of all that calculated splendor, seated at a small writing table near the east window, with a household account book open before her, and a list in her hand that she appeared to be cross-referencing with the seating plan, was a woman in a gray dress who was so thoroughly occupied with her work that she had not looked up when he entered. He noticed her the way he noticed anything anomalous, with the measuring attention of a man who has trained himself to identify what does not fit the expected pattern. Everyone else in the room was performing the evening. She was managing it. The seating arrangement she was consulting, he recognized, was Thornwell's. Lady Thornwell had complained about it twice already. Whoever this woman was, she had been asked to correct it. She looked up once, briefly, to check a name against the plan, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second before she returned to her list. He moved on, but he did not stop thinking about the gray dress and the account book for the remainder of the evening. He had been managing Ashworth Park alone for 4 years, since his mother's death in the autumn of 1815, which had left a gap in the estate's administration that his own considerable competence had not entirely filled, because the gap was not primarily administrative. His mother had been the person who understood the estate's human architecture, which tenant family required what attention in which season, which of the wool merchant contracts could bear renegotiation, and which could not, which of the household staff needed to be retained at all costs, and which were quietly managing small arrangements she had chosen not to disturb. Julian had the figures. He had always had the figures. What he found, 4 years later, was that figures were not sufficient. There were things the estate needed that he could not name with precision, and this bothered him in the way that any unresolved problem bothered him, constantly, at intervals, like a note played in the wrong key. He had not thought about marriage as a solution. He had thought about it as an obligation, which was different. His father, the 5th Duke, Sir Edmund Ashworth, who had retired from public life into a posture of elaborate dissatisfaction at his London house, had made his views on the matter available at their last meeting in the form of a list of suitable candidates, 3 of whom were daughters of men who owed Edmund professional favors. Julian had read the list. He had placed it in the top drawer of his study desk, where it remained, unactioned. He hired a private investigator the week after the Thornwell gathering, not because he had decided anything, because he found it easier to decide things when he had facts. The report came back in 11 days. It was thorough. The investigator had spoken with Gerald Fordham's solicitor, not Thomas Graves, who had retired the previous year, but his successor, who was less careful about confidentiality, and with 2 of the wool merchants who had dealt with the Fordham household accounts, and with the landlord of a property in 3 neighboring parishes whose lease terms had been renegotiated, in 1813, to figures significantly more favorable than the market standard at the time. The report said, Harriet Eleanor Chance, age 31, father deceased 1808, no formal title, no dowry of substance, currently resident as companion in the household of Gerald Fordham, Worcestershire, has managed all Fordham estate accounts since 1808, unacknowledged and unsalaried beyond a modest household allowance. no legal standing to act on any of the accounts she manages, has nevertheless done so, with verifiable results. 3 creditors interviewed describe her as the most precise correspondent they have encountered in 30 years of business. The lease renegotiation of 1813 recovered £80 annually in the first year alone. She keeps records. Julian read the report twice. Then he read the section about the lease renegotiation a third time. He sat with it for 2 days before he did anything. On the third day, he rode to Thornwell House on the stated pretext of the boundary documentation, which did still require attention, and he managed the conversation with Lady Thornwell in a way that resulted in an invitation being extended to the Fordham household for the following month's autumn house party at Ashworth Park. It was the most deliberate thing he had done in 4 years. He was not certain it would result in anything, but he had not been able to stop thinking about the woman in the gray dress who had been correcting a seating plan in the middle of a gathering, and about the lease clause that had recovered £80 annually, and about the estate's quarterly wool merchant accounts that he knew, with a certainty he had not acted on until this moment, were not quite right. He stood in the corridor outside the estate steward's office on the evening of the third day of the house party and listened. He had not planned to listen. He had come to retrieve a document, but the light was on inside, past 11, which no footman would have been working at, and he heard, clearly, the sound of pages turning in the deliberate, systematic way of someone conducting a search rather than casual reading. He did not interrupt. He waited. Then, after a moment's decision that he could not have precisely explained, he came back in the morning and left the key on the study table where she would find it. She found it at breakfast, where it was placed beside her coffee cup by a footman who said only that it was from His Grace. She looked at it for a long time without picking it up. He had watched, from the corridor doorway, to see how long she waited before she put it in her pocket. She put it in her pocket on the 4th look, a considered decision, by someone who did not make unconsidered ones. He found that he was satisfied. The house party at Ashworth Park had assembled, in the fortnight since its commencement, into a social arrangement of considerable precision. Julian had not intended it as a social arrangement. He had intended it as a practical evaluation, framed by the calendrical requirement of autumn agricultural review meetings that genuinely required his presence. But the guests had arranged themselves according to their own requirements, and the arrangement had produced, as arrangements at country house parties reliably did, a kind of competitive atmosphere that he found exhausting, and that Harriet, he observed, was managing with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had seen every version of this particular performance before. The primary performance was being conducted by Lady Cecily Wharton. Lady Cecily was the daughter of Viscount Wharton, 24 years old, precisely beautiful in the way that suggested considerable attention to the work of appearing effortless, and entirely certain, as was everyone in the room, including Gerald Fordham's wife, who had made 2 separate remarks about it within Harriet's hearing, that the Duke of Ashworth's autumn house party represented the logical conclusion of a courtship that had been arranged, in the social imagination of 3 counties, for at least 18 months. She was credentialed, connected, graceful, and possessed of a laugh that carried clearly across a drawing room without being considered loud. She wore a different dress each day. She had never, in Harriet's observation, carried an account book. She had also, on the 2nd day of the party, when Harriet was arranging the morning room's writing materials for the correspondence hour that Lady Thornwell had requested she organize, turned from her conversation with the Duke's distant cousin to observe Harriet's work and say, pleasantly, "How useful you are, Miss Chance. I wonder if you were born knowing where everything ought to go." The room had contained 4 witnesses. Harriet looked up from the writing paper she was arranging and said, with the same pleasantness, "I learned it from practice. The quarterly accounts will require the east table this afternoon. I have already spoken to the footman. Will that arrangement suit everyone?" And she returned to her list. Lady Cecily had smiled with the serene confidence of a woman who had scored a point. She had not scored a point, but Harriet did not bother to explain this, because the explanation would have required more words than the moment warranted, and her list was not finished. The institutional opposition was subtler. Julian's father, the 5th Duke, Sir Edmund Ashworth, was not in residence. He never came to Ashworth Park if he could manage it, and he generally could manage it, but his presence was felt through correspondence. Julian had shown Harriet, on the 5th morning of the party, a letter that had arrived from London. He showed it to her without preamble. He handed it to her across the breakfast table, after the other guests had dispersed, with the same matter-of-fact quality with which he had placed the ledger before her on the night in the library. The letter was from Sir Edmund to his son. It was 3 pages. Its central argument was that the Wharton match represented the kind of alliance that sustained a dukedom over generations, that the requirements of the succession were not a personal preference, but a structural obligation, and that the Duke's recent behavior, the phrase was Edmund's own, suggested a distraction of a kind his position could not accommodate. There was no name in the letter. There did not need to be. Harriet read it twice. She set it on the table. She said, "He is not wrong about the structural obligation. He is wrong about the conclusion." Julian said, "Yes." She looked at him. He was watching her with the measuring attention she had come to recognize as his version of considerable feeling, expressed through complete external stillness. She picked up her coffee cup and said, "The wool merchant contracts will need to be addressed before December. Have you reviewed the 1817 figures I consolidated?" "Last night," he said. "You found 3 additional instances." "4," she said. "I'll show you this evening." She managed, in the 6 days following the library key, to make herself useful in ways that did not announce themselves as useful. That was the only kind of useful she had ever known how to be. She reviewed the estate's tenant rent ledgers and produced a 1-page summary of variance from the previous 5 years. The rents had been rising in 3 of the 8 tenant farms, at a rate that exceeded both the Agricultural Improvement Index and the regional standard, and 2 of those farms showed signs of structural neglect in the maintenance records that suggested the increased rent was not being reinvested in the properties. She left the summary on Julian's study desk with a note that said only, "Third column, farms 4 and 7, worth a conversation with the steward." She attended the mandatory social events and sat in the seats she was assigned, which were never at the center of any arrangement. She watched Lady Cecily manage the drawing room with the expertise of a woman trained from childhood to command a room's attention, and she acknowledged, privately, that this was a genuine skill that should not be dismissed simply because it was being deployed in competition. Lady Cecily would make a capable duchess in several of the ways a duchess was required to be capable. But she had not found the 4 additional wool merchant discrepancies, and she had not produced a 1-page variance summary that identified which tenant farms required steward conversations before the winter. The house party's 3rd week brought the autumn wool merchant meeting, which Julian had scheduled as part of the agricultural review. It was conducted in the estate's formal dining room, rearranged for the purpose. 8 men, chairs at the long table, papers stacked in front of each position. Harriet was not, technically, a party to any of it. She had been asked by Julian, 3 days prior, to prepare a summary of the contract terms for the 3 primary merchants in the estate's current arrangement. She prepared rather more than a summary. She had spent 2 evenings in the library, using the key, which she carried in her dress pocket and touched periodically, as one might touch a thing one still cannot entirely believe is there, working through the full contract history of the estate's wool trade arrangements, going back to 1810. The pattern she found was architectural in its consistency. Every 3 years, when the merchant contracts came up for renewal, the estate's steward had accepted the first offered terms without negotiation. In 3 renewal cycles, this had cost Ashworth Park an estimated £260 in aggregate margin foregone, not through fraud, but through an absence of the particular skill that negotiation requires, which is the ability to hold a position past the moment when the other party expects you to relent. She wrote this up in 4 pages, with the figures laid out in a table, the source documents cited by Ledger and Page, and 3 alternative contract terms she had drafted for the current renewal, that each recovered a different portion of the foregone margin, depending on how much pressure the estate was willing to apply. She gave it to Julian the morning of the meeting. He read it at the breakfast table while the other guests moved around them, a situation he appeared not to notice, and she had long since ceased to be surprised by. He read all 4 pages. He read the contract alternatives twice. Then he looked up. "Will you be available?" he said, "if I have questions during the meeting?" She had managed 14 creditor negotiations and 4 instances of contract renegotiation for a household that had never given her a title or a salary. She could manage this. "I'll be in the morning room," she said. He came to the morning room twice during the 3-hour meeting. The first time, he showed her a counter-term that the primary merchant had proposed and asked whether the language in Clause 7 was standard. It was not standard. It was a clause she had seen before in the Fordham accounts from the same merchant network. and it created an automatic renewal trigger that would lock the estate into the current pricing for 5 years. She said so. She showed him the comparable language from the Fordham documents she had brought in her notebook. He went back to the meeting. The second time, he came without a specific question. He stood in the morning room doorway for a moment, and she looked up from the account she was reading, and he said, "The merchant accepted the second alternative." She set down her pen. "The 200 annually?" "The 240, he said. He came up. She looked at him with a composure that cost her more than she allowed onto her face. Because £240 annually, recovered from a single contract renewal through the identification of a 3-cycle pattern, was not a small thing. It was the kind of result that Thomas Graves would have written down in his notebook with a specific date beside it. "That is well done," she said. "You did it," Julian said. "I simply presented the evidence." He said it with the matter-of-fact quality that she had come to understand was not dismissiveness, but its precise opposite, the acknowledgement of a person who did not mistake performance for work. She looked down at her account. She said, "The third merchant will be more difficult. He has been with the estate for 12 years, and he knows the steward well. I have drafted a separate approach for that one." "I know," Julian said. "I read it." He did not say anything further. He was gone before she could determine what expression she had made. There was an evening in the third week that she returned to for years afterward, not because anything dramatic occurred in it, but because it was the first time she understood clearly what was happening between them. The other guests had retired after dinner. Julian had stayed in the library. She had seen the light under the door when she passed, coming back from the kitchens where she had spoken to the housekeeper about the following week's provisioning schedule. She had her library key. She was not sure whether it was an intrusion to use it when he was already there. She used it. He was at the reading table, with the estate map open before him, the original survey map, she recognized, from the boundary documentation dispute with Thornwell, that was still technically unresolved. He did not look up when she came in. She went to the shelf where the tenant ledgers were kept, retrieved the one she needed, and sat at the other end of the table. They worked in silence for perhaps 40 minutes. It was not the silence of two people avoiding conversation. It was the silence of two people who had, at some point she could not precisely identify, ceased to require explanation for each other's presence. He said, without looking up, "There is a commission of accounts scheduled for January. 3 of the county's largest estates present their annual summaries to a panel of investors and agricultural trustees. Ashworth has not participated for 4 years. She looked up from the tenant ledger. "Why not?" "My mother managed the submission. After she died, I found I did not want to do it without understanding it fully." He turned a page on the survey map. "I understand it now. I intend to submit this year." She returned to the ledger. "The investor panel will want the variance analysis." "Yes." "I can have it completed by November." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Harriet." It was the first time he had used her given name. He said it in the same measured tone he used for everything, without ornament, as though it were simply the correct word for what he needed to say. She looked up. He had taken off his coat. She noticed this now, that he had set it over the back of his chair at some point in the evening, which meant he had been here for some time and had not been performing the evening for anyone. He was in his waistcoat and shirt sleeves, in his own library, working, and he looked at her across the reading table with the expression that was not unclassified anymore. "I would like you to present the submission," he said. She looked at him steadily. "The panel will have questions about the source." "I know." "They will ask who prepared it." "I know," he said. "I intend to tell them." She held the look for a moment longer. Then she looked down at the tenant ledger and placed her finger on the line she had been reading. "I will need access to the survey records from 1812 through current. The cabinet key is in the second drawer of the study desk," he said. "It has been there since Thursday." She had not known that. She looked up again, briefly, and he was watching her with that particular stillness, and she understood that he had placed it there on Thursday, 3 days ago, and had said nothing, because he had been waiting to see whether she would find it herself. She had not found it. She felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular embarrassment of having failed to notice something that mattered. "I didn't look in that drawer," she said. "No," he said. "Next time you will." She straightened her spine and returned to her accounts. He returned to his map. But something had settled in the room. like a stone dropped into still water, and she was aware of it for the rest of the evening. The following morning she came to breakfast early and found his cravat noticeably crooked. He had, she had observed, a systematic tendency to tie it correctly and then adjust it once in a manner that undid the lower knot. She watched him for a moment, then said, "It has been crooked since you sat down. Left side, lower knot." And she reached across, without asking permission, and straightened it in 2 movements. He was entirely still under her hands. "Thank you," he said when she had finished. 40 minutes, she said. "I noticed when you came in." He looked at her. "You waited 40 minutes. I was watching to see if you would notice yourself." She sat back down and picked up her coffee cup. "You didn't." He considered this. Then, "Will you tell me when it happens in future?" "If I am there," she said. They both understood that the question was not about cravats. By the end of the 3rd week, Lady Cecily had become aware that something had shifted in the geometry of the household, and she had the social acuity to understand it, even if she could not precisely identify its cause. She had been gracious, and she had been visible, and she had conducted every drawing-room conversation with the fluency of a woman who had been trained for precisely this role. She had also, Harriet observed, begun to watch Julian in a way that was less the watching of a woman expecting to be chosen and more the watching of a woman recalibrating her expectations. Harriet did not take satisfaction in this. She was not certain of anything, and she had been not certain about things before in a way that had concluded without incident, and she was aware that the Duke's father's letter existed, and that the structural machinery of the world existed, and that she had no title and no dowry and 31 years of managed accounts to recommend her, which was a form of capital that the established machinery was not built to process. She pressed one hand briefly against the wall of the corridor after dinner on the night of the 21st day, when she had passed Julian's study and heard, through the closed door, the sound of him playing the piano that sat in the room's east corner. A piece she did not recognize, something without a name, the kind of music a person plays when they are not performing for anyone. She had not known he played, she had never heard anyone mention it. She stood in the corridor for a long moment. Then she went to bed, and she did not sleep immediately, and in the morning she took out Thomas Graves's advice from where she kept it in her memory, and examined it the way she examined everything that mattered, practically, specifically, without sentimentality. She had done real work. She had figures and dates and outcomes. She had a notebook, she had a key, and she had a cabinet key, and she had been asked to present a submission to an investor panel that had not received Ashworth's accounts in 4 years. She had no guarantee of anything beyond that, but she had managed 6 creditor negotiations and a county-level commission of accounts in the same calendar year before, for a household that had never acknowledged it, and she could manage this. The County Commission of Accounts convened on the 14th of January, 1819, in the formal assembly rooms at Dorchester, in a chamber that smelled of old paper and winter coal smoke, and the particular quality of rooms where financial authority is exercised by men who have never considered that any of this might be otherwise. There were 17 men on the panel and in the observer chairs. 9 were agricultural trustees. 4 were private investors with holdings across the county's 3 primary estate networks. 2 were county solicitors. 1 was Sir Edmund Ashworth, 5th Duke, who had made the journey from London, and whose presence Julian had not forewarned Harriet about, because, she suspected, he had not known. She knew it when she saw him, the same height as Julian, the same posture, older and less contained, with the expression of a man who has walked into a room, expecting one arrangement, and found another. His eyes went to Harriet immediately, in the way that people's eyes go to things they consider anomalous, and then to Julian, and what passed across his face was not anger, but something colder and more structural, the expression of a man who believes the rules exist for reasons, and who has found someone proposing an exception. Harriet had 47 pages of documented accounts, 3 contract alternatives in annotated copies, a 4-page variance analysis, and a 1-page summary of the wool merchant recovery figures. She had checked the figures 4 times. She had checked them a 5th time the morning of the commission. She stood at the front of the room. Julian sat in the observer chairs, not at the front. He had specifically chosen the observer chairs, which she understood was a deliberate arrangement. He was not presenting, she was. She began with the current year figures, which were unambiguous. The estate had recovered £240 in the wool merchant contract renegotiation, £46 in the corrected tenant farm rate adjustment, and £112 in the recovered steward commission from the 1815 to 1817 period. Total, £398 in the current operating year, against the previous 4-year average of the equivalent account categories. She set the table in front of the panel lead and indicated the columns. She was 3 minutes into the presentation when one of the county solicitors, a man named Cartwright, gray-haired, who had not looked away from her since she stood up, said, "Miss Chance, on what authority do you present these accounts?" The chamber did not move immediately. There was a suspended moment. Harriet looked at Cartwright with a composure that had been built over 11 years and was not going to fail her in this room. "I prepared the accounts," she said. The authority for the presentation was given by the Duke of Ashworth. She looked at the table of documents in front of her. The figures are verified and sourced. The source citations are on page 4. If you would like to begin there, rather than with the summary, I can reorder the presentation. Cartwright said, "The Commission has historically received Ashworth's accounts from the estate steward." "The estate steward prepared the accounts in previous years," Harriet said. "He was not in those years identifying the pattern of adjustment I have documented on pages 9 through 14. I have." The Commission lead, a man named Harrington, who had the look of a person who had managed difficult situations before and had chosen his own preferences on the question of useful information, turned to page 9 without further comment. Sir Edmund said, from the observer chairs, "Harrington, the Commission's charter requires. The charter requires verified accounts submitted by an authorized representative of the estate," Harrington said, without looking up from page 9. "I am reading the authorization letter." He held it up briefly. It was, Harriet knew, on Ashworth ducal letterhead, in Julian's hand. "Continue, Miss Chance," she continued. She presented for 40 minutes. She answered 7 questions. 2 of the questions came from agricultural trustees who were, she recognized, asking not from opposition, but from the particular curiosity of men who had found the accounts more interesting than they had expected. 1 question came from an investor who wanted the wool merchant alternative terms clarified. She had the original contract language on page 31 and walked him through the variants. 1 came from Sir Edmund, who asked, in a controlled and formal voice, whether the estate steward was aware of the discrepancies she had identified. "He is aware of them now," Harriet said. "He was not the author of the original adjustment. The adjustments were made by his predecessor. I recommended to His Grace that the current steward review his predecessor's files for the 1812-1817 period, which he has done." "And who recommended this review?" Sir Edmund said. "I did, Your Grace," Harriet said. The room was very quiet. Sir Edmund looked at her for a long moment. He had the Ashworth stillness. She could see where Julian had gotten it, but where Julian's stillness was the stillness of a man making decisions, Sir Edmund's was the stillness of a man resisting them. He looked at the accounts on the table in front of him. He turned to page 9. He did not say anything further. When the commission concluded, Harrington spoke to Julian at the chamber entrance for 3 minutes. Harriet could not hear what was said. She was organizing her papers at the presenter's table, returning documents to their correct order, when she heard footsteps behind her that she recognized before she turned. The pace, the weight, the purposefulness. Julian said, quietly, for her alone, "Harrington wants the variance summary for his own county records." He asked if the author would permit it. She turned. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I would ask." She held the look for a moment. The chamber was emptying. People moving toward the exit. Conversations beginning in the low murmur of a room recalibrating. Lady Cecily was not here. This was not her domain. But Sir Edmund was still in his chair. She could see him over Julian's shoulder, and he was looking at the accounts she had placed before him. "Yes," she said to Julian, "he may have it." Julian said, "Harriet." He said it the same way he had said it in the library, measured and without ornament. Then he went down on one knee. The chamber was not empty. There were 9 people still present, including 2 county solicitors and 1 agricultural trustee. Julian Ashworth, 6th Duke of Ashworth, went down on one knee, on the stone floor of the Dorchester Assembly Rooms in front of all of them, took her gloved hand, and held it. He did not say a great deal. He said, "I would like to offer you the position you have already been occupying, made permanent and official, and everything else that comes with it." She looked at him. The room understood what it was witnessing before anyone had put words to it. She thought about it. She thought about it the way she thought about everything that mattered, completely, without shortcuts. She thought about the library at midnight, and the key the next morning, and the cabinet key in the second drawer, and the cravat, and the music through the closed door, and the letter from his father, and the structural machinery of the world, and the 47 pages of verified accounts she had just presented, and Thomas Graves's advice about keeping records, specific figures, dates, outcomes. Then she said, yes. He kissed her hand. The room changed. Sir Edmund left the chamber without speaking to either of them, but she saw him, as she was collecting the last of her papers, pause at the door and look back once, not at Julian, but at the table where her accounts were still laid out, at the neat columns and the cited sources and the figures she had checked 5 times. His expression was not warm, it was not converted, but it was the expression of a man who has been shown something he cannot dismiss, however much he would prefer to, and who is in the process of deciding what to do with that. He came to the library at Ashworth Park 6 weeks later, while Julian was with the estate steward, and Harriet was working at the reading table. He did not knock, the door was open. He stood in the doorway, and she looked up, and he said, "The January Commission report has been published." Harrington cited the variance analysis by name. He paused. "Your name?" she said. "Yes." He told Julian he intended to. Sir Edmund looked at her for a moment. He said, "I was wrong about the figure on page 11. I said 6% variance. It was 8. She looked at him steadily. "Page 11 shows the 5-year rolling average. If you were calculating against the previous year only, 6% is correct. 8% is the 5-year figure." He said, "I see." He said it in the tone of a man who does not enjoy being corrected, and is in the process of deciding whether to acknowledge that she was not, in this case, wrong. "I see," was all he said. Then he left. It was not warmth, it was not conversion, but it was, she recognized, the closest thing to acknowledgement she was going to receive from Edmund Ashworth, and she understood it for what it was, a partial recalibration from a man who had built his world on a set of rules that she had failed to fit, and who was now in the uncomfortable position of revising some of the rules. She returned to her accounts. Julian proposed to her a second time 3 weeks later, in the library, after midnight, which seemed to her an appropriate location for anything important that happened between them. There were no witnesses. There was no commission present, no observer chairs, no county solicitors. There was a lamp and the Ashworth Park estate accounts, and the Persian carpet, and 2 people who had become each other's necessary company before either of them had admitted it. He sat across from her at the reading table and said, without preamble, "I proposed to you in front of 9 people because you deserved witnesses. I want to say it again, privately, because what I said to you in that chamber was efficient and not complete." She looked at him, she set down her pen. "Not because the estate requires managing," he said, "and not because the commission cited your name, and not because my father has been required to revise his figure on page 11, but because I have spent 4 years in this house, without anyone who thought the way you think, and I had not understood until you arrived what the absence was costing me. And because you found £143 in a library at midnight, in a dress you had already worn 3 times, and you were not embarrassed, and you were not sorry, and you were right." She was quiet for a moment. "I brought everything I had," she said, "and I put it to work. That is all I have ever known how to do." "I know," he said. "It is sufficient. It is more than sufficient." She thought about it, the way she thought about everything, completely and without shortcuts. Then she said, "I accepted the first time. The acceptance stands." He said, "I know that too. I wanted you to have the second proposal anyway." She looked at him across the reading table, his waistcoat and shirt sleeves, his cravat correctly tied for once, the survey map folded at his elbow, the lamp burning between them. She thought that this was what she had been doing for 11 years without knowing she was doing it, preparing to be in a room where someone looked at the work and saw it clearly. She reached across the table and turned the ledger to the page she had been on. "The 3rd merchant contract comes up in March," she said. "I want to start early." "Then start early," he said, and he picked up his own document, and they worked, in the silence that required no explanation, until the lamp ran low and the February dark pressed at the windows of the library, and Harriet Chance, who had been keeping rooms, standing for 11 years without credit, sat in a room that was finally, undeniably, beginning to be hers. They were married in April, quietly, in the church, on the estate's south edge, that had married 6 generations of Ashworths, and had never, to anyone's recorded knowledge, married a woman who had arrived at the family with 47 pages of county commission accounts and a cloth-bound notebook of creditor negotiations. The Fordham household attended. Gerald shook Julian's hand and said something adequate. Mrs. Fordham wore a hat of considerable ambition and said nothing to Harriet directly, which Harriet found she did not mind at all. Thomas Graves's successor attended, having been invited by Julian on the grounds that the Fordham estate accounts were transferring to Ashworth's solicitor's management, a change that Harriet had recommended and that Gerald had agreed to with the same distracted approval he gave to everything she recommended. The successor told her at the reception afterward that Mr. Graves had written a note about her in his personal records 7 years ago, which the successor had found upon inheriting the files. The note said, Miss H. Chance, Estate Management, Worcestershire, twice in a career. Watch for her name. Harriet thanked him. She thought about Thomas Graves for a long moment, and about the quiet, specific way that recognition sometimes travels, arriving years later through unexpected channels, and she found that it settled in her rather than overwhelmed her, which was, she supposed, the accurate response to something that had always been true and had simply taken time to be documented. Charlotte Pearson, who had been the nearest thing to a genuine friend the house party had produced, a woman of 34, with a direct manner and the useful quality of saying what she thought without requiring the other person to guess at it, came to Ashworth Park in the summer with her husband, who was a barrister of some distinction, and who spent most of the visit in animated conversation with Julian about the county's agricultural reform proposals. Charlotte sat with Harriet in the garden on 2 successive afternoons and said, on the second one, "You look like a person who has arrived somewhere." She considered Harriet with unguarded attention. "You did not look like that when I met you." "I know," Harriet said. "Where did you arrive?" Harriet looked at the garden, the kitchen garden to her left, which she had reorganized in May according to a plan she had drafted in March, and the tenant farms visible past the east boundary, and the house behind her, which contained 12,000 books and a reading table and a key she had been given the morning after she was found using it without permission. "At a place where the work is credited," she said. "That is all I ever wanted." Charlotte nodded, as though this was the most reasonable thing she had ever heard, which was one of the primary reasons Harriet liked her. The estate reform program that Harriet submitted to the County Agricultural Trust in 1820 was adopted by 4 neighboring estates within 2 years. It addressed 3 specific points: the pattern of steward oversight that had allowed the commission adjustments in the 1815 to 1817 period, a standardized lease renewal clause that protected tenant farms from rate increases that exceeded the Regional Improvement Index, and a template for quarterly account summaries that made the variance between receipt ledgers and summary figures visible at a glance. The document bore her name. Julian had insisted, she had not argued. 3 of the 17 men who had been in the Dorchester Assembly Room on the 14th of January, 1819, requested copies of the reform program from the county trust. One of them was Harrington. Another was the investor who had wanted the wool merchant alternative terms clarified. The third was a county solicitor she had not expected. She kept a copy of the request letters in the cloth-bound notebook, beside the 37 accounts and the 14 creditor negotiations, and the 9 lease renewals. Specific figures, dates, outcomes. Their son was born in the spring of 1821, and they named him George, for her father, who had educated her past, what her situation required, and had never seen what she did with it. He had his father's dark eyes, and his mother's habit of examining any new object presented to him, with careful, thorough attention, before deciding what to make of it. He secured the succession, and Julian told his father so in a letter that Harriet did not see and did not ask about, because there were things between fathers and sons that were not hers to manage. Sir Edmund came to Ashworth Park once more, when George was 8 months old. He stood in the doorway of the morning room, where Harriet was working at the writing table with the baby on a blanket at her feet, and he looked at the room's arrangement, the accounts, the annotated contract pages, the child, the lamp burning in the afternoon light. For a long moment, he said nothing. He looked at George. Then he said, to Harriet, "The 1820 reform program. The variance clause in Section 3. I assume that was yours." "Yes," she said. He said, "It is well constructed." He said it in the tone of a man who has revised one of his rules. Incompletely, and without warmth, but without contempt. Then he left. She looked at the door where he had been. She picked up her pen. She thought that this, too, was a form of acknowledgement, arrived through unexpected channels, and she wrote it in the notebook because Thomas Graves had told her to keep specific figures, dates, and outcomes, and she intended to keep all of them. Julian found her there an hour later, when the afternoon had gone gray at the windows, and George had fallen asleep on the blanket with one fist raised beside his ear. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him. She knew by the particular quality of his presence in a room, which she had learned to recognize without turning, the same way she had learned to recognize his footsteps and his silence. He looked at her, and at the accounts, and at the sleeping child on the floor between them. She knew he was looking. She did not turn immediately. She finished the line she was writing, marked it, and set down her pen. Then she turned and looked at him, and he was watching her with the expression that had stopped being unclassified a long time ago, the expression of a man who has been given something he had not known how to ask for, and who has not, in the 2 years since, ceased to be aware of it. She said, "Your cravat is straight." "I tied it twice," he said. "I noticed," she said. He crossed the room, stepping carefully around the sleeping child, and sat beside her at the writing table. He looked at the accounts she had been working on. He reached across and turned the page to the column she had been annotating and read it without a word, in the way of a man who understood what he was looking at and did not need her to explain it. Outside, the April light was beginning to find the estate's east boundary, moving across the tenant farms and the kitchen garden and the old stone wall of the church where 6 generations of Ashworths had been married, and where a 7th generation slept on a blanket on a morning room floor, with one fist raised beside his ear. Harriet Chance, who had arrived at Ashworth Park 11 years after her father's death in a dress she had already worn 3 times, with 47 pages of verified accounts and a cloth-bound notebook in the intention to survive whatever came next, turned to the next page in the ledger and went on.